Hi, this is Stu Tinker from SK Tours in Derry, Maine, and I'm listening to the Stephen King podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Stephen King podcast. This is episode 96, and thank you for lending your ears once again to listen to your host, Lou Sytsma, talk about the latest news and reviews in the world or universe of Stephen King, or maybe that's the multiverse. This is going to be a great episode. I have a special guest, Stephen Spignesi, writer of several Stephen King tomes, most recently Stephen King, American Master. And he joins me on this podcast to review Stephen King's latest book, Elevation. Also, I'll be taking a look at the final 4 episodes of Mr. Mercedes Season 2. So that'll be episodes 7 through 10. Needless to say, this is going to be a spoiler-filled episode. So if you haven't read Elevation or seen the remaining episodes of Season 2 of Mr. Mercedes, you'll want to skip this podcast until later. There will be some news that you can listen to now, but please do come back if you haven't had a chance to read or see the things that we're discussing today. So, as they say in the biz, without further ado, let's get into it.
Welcome, welcome. Do not fear the door that lies before you. We will protect you. We are your guides, Hans and Lou, and we will give you the latest in Stephen King news. But before we do so, you must prove yourself worthy. You must open the door and join us in the Deathroom.
The first item in news is that Joyland is going to be adapted to the small screen. This is going to be adapted for Freeform, which is a adjunct of ABC Family Television, and it's a streaming service. Not familiar with it, but an ABC Family TV seems like a bit of a strange place for this to land, but I assume the streaming Freeform version of ABC Family is a little more open to more mature material. This will be adapted by writers Chris Pena of Jane the Virgin fame, Iris Narutesh, The Stoning of Soraya M. No idea when that's going to be aired. Probably sometime next year, so we'll have to keep an eye out on that. Further note is veteran producer Bill Haber, also produced CW's Beauty and the Beast, TNT's Rosalie and Isles, and most recently CW's military drama series Valor. So it seems to have a fairly good pedigree behind it, and it doesn't say here if it's going to be it looks like it's going to be a series, so that's going to be interesting because that's not one of King's bigger books, but we'll have to see what they do with it. So keep your eyes and ears out on the interwebs for any further announcements about that. Up next is the announcement from AT&T Audience Network that Mr. Mercedes has been renewed for Season 3. Now, if you've watched Season 2 of Mr. Mercedes, you know that what direction that's going to take is really up in the air at this point. I have some wild-ass crazy theory about that. My initial theory that maybe because Jack Bender, the showrunner of Mr. Mercedes, also has the rights to The Outsider, that might be where Season 3 heads. But in light of the way the last few episodes played out, I came up with an even wilder theory, which I hope you enjoy, but I wouldn't want to bet the farm on it. So check out my reviews of episodes 7 through 10 of Mr. Mercedes, and you'll find out what that crazy theory I have is. And this is an interesting, of a bit odd piece of news, is that John Campiano, who was part of the team that did the excellent Pet Sematary documentary, has a new project that he's working on, and it's a short film titled Georgie, and it stars actor Tony Dakota, who played Georgie in the original It miniseries. Also along for the ride is Ben Heller, who played the young Stanley Uris from the 1990 It miniseries as well. So this is an unofficial sequel to the original miniseries, which is interesting since we all know that Georgie died in that. So I'm quite curious to see how Mr. Campiano is going to handle this unofficial sequels. I don't know if that's going to be available for widespread consumption or not, so we'll just have to see how this is going to be distributed. If maybe it's going to be part of the It documentary that Mr. Campiano is working on. We'll have to see where this lands. Also in the news is Dr. Sleep casting news, and that is that young Canadian actor Jacob Tremblay, who has had a pretty hot career so far. And in our previous podcast, Bryant Burnett and me, when we were reviewing the Mike Flanagan's reimagining of The Haunting of Hill House, we discussed what our thoughts on who he could play. My money's on him playing the young Danny Torrance in the flashback sequences at the beginning of the book, but there's also the possibility that he could play one of the victims as well. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But if you want to hear more thoughts on that bit of casting news, check out the previous podcast. All I can say is that this actor looks, for the first time in my mind, the way I pictured Danny Torrance. The only thing I would say is his hair color might be a little bit light, but that's so minor compared to everything else that I'm really looking forward to seeing what this kid is going to do in the Dr. Sleep movie. So that's exciting news. And then finally, we have one more item, and this is, I don't know if I brought this up before, but if you go over to Suntup, that's SUNTUP Editions, or check out Lilia's site. He's got links up for this as well. Jason Seacrest has done a fantastic 2-part interview with Bill Thompson, the first agent that Stephen King had. And there are some tidbits in there. If you're a longtime fan of anything, anytime you read an interview or an article on somebody that you've been following, it's pretty well the same material every time. But in this one, there's some definitely new tidbits that I was never aware of. Thompson got the first draft of Rage, which was called Getting It On. He also got an early cut of Carrie book, and that has some interesting material in the first draft that I've never heard about, especially since Carrie turns into a giant figure, literally. And she develops horns. Lightning comes from her fingertips. She blasts an airplane out of the sky. So there's some information here that I don't think many of us or any of us really knew until Jason did these interviews. So I highly recommend this 2-part interview that he's done with Bill Thompson. It's just a gold mine of new Stephen King info. So please check that out. And that is the news.
This is great. What's our job? We'd like drive around, pick up stiffs or what?
It's time for reviews from the night shift.
All right, everyone, welcome back. And in this segment, we're going to talk about Stephen King's latest book, Elevation. And to do that, I have with me a special guest, Steve Spignesi. Hello, Steve. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Lou?
Doing very awesome, thank you. And before we get into Elevation, I just wanted to say I've just read your book, the Stephen King, American Master, and I really enjoyed it. It's a great, you can read it all at once, or you can sit down and just, read a segment at a time. So it's pretty awesome.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm glad you liked it, because that was my intent, that it be a reading book and or a browsing book. So I'm glad that it worked for you.
Okay, so we're here to talk about Elevation. And as I mentioned up front, we are going full on spoilers in this. So if you haven't read the book, set aside this segment of the podcast. I will timestamp it for you so that you can do that. But we're going to get right into it. So, Steve, we've both had chances to read Elevation, and I'd like to hear your overall thoughts on it.
Well, first of all, King is a master at the shorter form. We all love the massive stands and its and outsiders and talismans. But King, as a short story and novella writer, is an absolute master. And I think Elevation is brilliant. I think it's one of the best short works he's ever done. I can understand. I hear a lot of fans saying, well, it's so thin, it's so small. No, it deserves that kind of special individualized treatment of being published originally as a hardcover. One critic I read said he thinks the final third of the book might be some of the best writing King has ever done, and I would have to agree. It's very, very impressive. I cried at the end, and I think it's an incredibly powerful and compelling statement with the classic King narrative voice that takes us inside the characters, inside Castle Rock, tells us an incredible story while at the same time making amazing points. I mean, when I first read it, I posted that, and I don't mean to go academic or even religio-spiritual on people when interpreting this book, but I am a retired English professor, so I kind of automatically look for deeper context and deeper meaning. And the book is a Christ allegory, complete with elements of the ascension and the very intense concept of enlightenment. A lot of fans have said, well, I didn't get that. Well, you know, the thing is, when I was teaching, I always used to tell my students regarding symbolism, metaphor, and allegory, you don't need to recognize it or see it in order to enjoy the writing. But if you do, then you can gain increased appreciation and more understanding of the writer's purpose. So I loved it.
I'm not an English professor, so I can't get into the same depth that you just went into there, Steve, but I have read a fair bit, and I really enjoyed this book quite a bit. I agree with everything that you said. I do believe this is a book about an elevated perspective, and we'll get into that a little deeper, but I love everything about this book. I love the story, and I think even the size of the book fits the theme of the book, because it seems like it's slight in size. Like if I put it up on top of Outsider, it's probably about 3/4 the size in width and height as Outsider. So it almost feels like the book is almost ready to float up in the air on its own at any given moment. So I really think, I don't know if that was a coincidence or if that was forethought by the publisher and King, but I really think that this is like another favorite book of mine is Neil Gaiman's Ocean at the End of the Lane. Mm-hmm. Also a small book, but both of these books, while they are small, they're filled with very big ideas. And the thing that really came across to me, as you mentioned, was this concept of elevated perception. And King acknowledges it in the foreword about thinking of Richard Matheson, who of course wrote another book with a character named Scott Carey, and that happened to be The Incredible Shrinking Man. And this book is really a bookend almost to that book, in that it talks about how the changing perceptions of a human being, if they change, they force them to re-examine their position in the universe as well. And I think that this book does that quite a bit and quite well as well. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is that there's been some back chatter, I guess, from people saying that this is a political book. And I totally disagree with that. Yes, there's occasional political observations, but it's more about it's more of a setting device for talking about the personality of the setting of the story, where it takes place in Castle Rock in Maine, which is a conservative area. And it's just making that as an observation. It's not putting down any sort of political viewpoint. What it's talking about is much more philosophical, and it's talking about human morality. So I think it's important. If anybody's been cautious about wanting to read this book, that's not an issue in this story. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I understand the argument, and the problem is that writers and art are mirrors. Art reflects life, and it's the artist's job, the writer's job, to be as honest as possible. It is a reality that intolerance, bigotry, homophobia, xenophobia is on the rise in our society, in our culture, in our politics. And for King as a writer to pretend that that doesn't exist when he's writing about a Republican conservative town where the situation that he depicts, a lesbian couple, is shunned because one of them insists on using the term "my wife" when describing her partner, her spouse. I feel it's absolutely true to the story. And again, it does reflect life. That's the whole purpose of art. And regarding Scott Carey, he is literally a shrinking man. And so the story puts forth questions. He's losing weight. He's not losing mass. What is he losing particularly, specifically? Is it his essence? Is it his soul? Is it a metaphorical way of describing self-sacrifice? Because basically he is willing to sacrifice himself for a greater good. And we catch that at the end of the turkey trot when he helps Deirdre across the finish line. And then the newspaper makes a Beatle reference, by the way, with the headline of she got by with little help from a friend. We know King is a big Beatle fan, which I loved seeing that. But the point is that Scott is again, a Christ allegory. He's willing to sacrifice himself. You notice that throughout the book, he refuses Dr. Bill's attempts to look at what's going on with him. He refuses to check into Mass General. He refuses to be poked and prodded and tested. And he really doesn't care, because I think King is saying to us, the character understands that when there is the need to change something, then we must work toward the greater good. And in Scott's case, he changes Castle Rock. He changes the perception of people toward this couple. He actually does a wondrous deed and then transforms. He actually becomes a body of light when he elevates himself at the end, and he's lost all weight. So now he's weightless and gravity has no say on him. So he just allows himself to float up holding a firework, which he then ignites, literally becoming light. And in Christianity, in Christology, Christ's body became non-physical and became a body of light, which is what the process of enlightenment is all about. So this is the King's most spiritually important work since the Green Mile, which asks the question, if Christ came back, would we recognize him or would we execute him again? And in this case, it's clearly that Scott sees a purpose to his final days. And of course, it's a metaphor for terminal illness and coping with one's finality and one's mortality. But it's also a commentary on the openness with which bigots and homophobes are practicing their intolerance in this age, this time. So I just think it's a complex work. It can be read on the surface. It can be read as a fable, as a story that is actually optimistic and uplifting. But if you just think a little bit deeper, and in fact, this is, well, you read American Master, that I talk a lot about King's significance as an important American literary figure. And this work contributes to that. He's clearly writing works that have meaning and importance beyond the sheer pleasure of reading it.
Right. I get what you're saying about the Christ allegory, and there's definitely those elements that you mentioned. I prefer to view it just as more of a person whose sense of perception of his world around him has become opened up because of this condition. And it's like you said, it is almost like he does go through this like a terminal illness. There's denial stage, and then because he won't look at the weigh scale, then he accepts it. And much like Scott Carey in The Incredible Shrinking Man, at the end, his moral compass or his perception of himself opens up as well and becomes larger because of this change in the normal way that we interact with the environment. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the story. It works on so many levels, like you said, and King, again, much like in 11/22/63, wisely avoids getting bogged down in the minutiae of how Scott Carey has come to this condition. That's much less important to the story than how Scott Carey reacts to his condition. So it's a really well done tale. And of course, the race itself is also an allegory of people's perceptions of him and his perceptions of himself, because through the whole race, people are making fun of him, saying he's watch out, you're going to have a heart attack and all this stuff. And I love the bit when the two teenagers pass him and say, see, I wouldn't want to be you. And he gets to return that jibe back to them as he passes them later on in the race. And then probably the most important part, and I think it's the part of the story where Scott fully accepts his condition, is once he gets over the hill, he sort of loses his last vestiges of human frailty, gets that second win, gets into that elevated state of mind that runners talk about when they dissociate their body from their mind, and finishes the race, makes that gesture that you mentioned of helping Deidre over the finish line and whatnot. So it's just a really well-crafted tale on so many levels.
Well, what you're describing, the race and then Scott's self-awareness, it speaks to that entire process of enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yep.
when you factor in that he becomes physically light at the end, I mean, it's just very, very deft. King's touch in this is it's not Christian, it's not religious, it's not woo-woo spirituality. It's simply a story of a man who is shrinking and accepts it and decides to use it for the greater good. And this is something that King has tackled in other works, but the note the ending, when he ascends, I said, he's not doing that. He's actually using the ascension and becoming a body of light as tropes, as plot points, as metaphors for what happens to Scott. For that, I get it. Why that critic said the last third of this book is some of King's greatest writing, and I really am very pleased with the length of it. You mentioned it earlier. You could read this in one sitting, and as you also mentioned, not getting into incredibly detailed minutia about their lives or about their thoughts or about anything that goes on in the town, not bringing in a huge slew of other characters' stories. It just, and publishing it as a single small hardcover volume. I think it's just a real achievement on King's part. I think it's a milestone book. And what I'm hearing from fans is that I didn't get any of that, or, oh my God, I get it. I see what you're saying. It never occurred to me. And the whole notion of, as a matter of fact, my literary agent was the one who explained the concept of enlightenment to me many, many years ago, because I always thought enlightenment meant like a Zen self-awareness. All of a sudden you're enlightened. And he said, no, look at the words. Look at the word light. Enlightenment. It speaks to what happened to Christ in Christology, in the mythology of Christianity. He became a body of light. And so you've got this physical process happening to Scott, and you've also got this conscious self-awareness where I will give myself for the greater good. And he does achieve the greater good, because suddenly there's more tolerance and acceptance, and he feels it's worth it. Although I'll tell you right now, the saddest part of the book, I mean, the ending, it was very tear-inducing, but he had to give away his cat. That really, he had to give Bill away, and that upset me almost more than anything else,
Yeah, Bill the cat. Yeah, even though I'm a dog person, I still got misty-eyed when he had to do that as well.
Yeah.
I like what you said about this being King's most spiritual book since The Green Mile. I could see that as well. But for me, this story has the same impact that Shawshank Redemption does, which I think is about the human spirit as well, in a different set of circumstances, and obviously being confined and whatnot. But this to me moved me just as much, if not more, than the Shawshank Redemption. And I just can't get by how it's with a lot of times with King's, it's not what he puts in the story, but it's what he leaves out, and he leaves you to read in between the lines. And I think that his restraint with this story is really good. I mean, I love what Matheson does with the Incredible Shrinking Man, especially at the end. I just want to read a couple of lines there, because I just think it's kind of like the flip end of what King's doing, but it's still the same thing. And it goes, I was continuing to shrink to become what? The infinitesimal? What was I? Still a human being? The unbelievably small and the unbelievably vast eventually would meet, like the closing of a giant circle. And where have we heard that before? I looked up as if somehow I would grasp the heavens, the universe, worlds beyond number. God's silver tapestry spread across the night. And in that moment, I knew the answer to the riddle of the infinite. I had thought in terms of man's own limited dimension. I had presumed upon nature that existence begins and ends in man's conception, not nature's. And I felt my body dwindling, melting, becoming nothing. My fears melted away, and in their place came acceptance. All this vast majesty of creation, it had to mean something, and then I meant something too. Yes, smaller than the smallest, I meant something too. To God, there is no zero. I still exist. So I think these two Scott Carys are experience the same journey. They're just coming at it from different ends of the telescope, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what's really intriguing to me, and it kind of asks a question or challenges somewhat my theory that Scott at the end of Elevation becomes pure light. Mm-hmm. Which is what his friends on the ground see. The last thing they see of Scott is blue, green, red, yellow light exploding into the air. But let me read the last paragraph of the book to you. They watched until the last golden sparks went out and the night was dark again. Somewhere high above them, Scott Carey continued to gain elevation, rising above the Earth's mortal grip with his face turned toward the stars.
Right.
His face turned toward the stars. So had he transformed into a being that actually still had like a corporeal presence where his face was actually in existence, or is that metaphorical? You know, I mean, it just made me think, because we picture, I mean, the image is incredible.
Yep.
This figure of light heading out with his face toward the stars. I mean, it's it's magnificent. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I think that there's enough metaphysical depth to the story itself that we can ask that question and come up with our own answer. Is he now a being of light, but still transparent and ethereal? Or is he just saying that is King just saying that, like, the being, the essence of Scott Carey is now becoming one, like at the end of the Matheson quote that you read, he's becoming one with the universe and with, which is basically a lot of physicists and quantum physicists say is just light. It boils down to light, you know? Right. So yeah, I just think it's, as you can tell, Lou, I was really impressed with this novella. You know, it's interesting. The cover says a novel. So I don't know. It's probably the publisher in order to say, well, we got to make it a hardcover, so we'll call it a novel. But, you know, when I was teaching, I mean, to me, up to 10,000, I used to tell kids, that's a short story. 10 to 40 is a novella. 40 plus is a novel. And I don't know, somebody said this is 25 to 28,000 words. I didn't do a count, so I don't know. But, I mean, was going to write about this in another book or even in a review. I would call it a novella. But again, King is a master at novellas and short stories. I mean, I was asked, there's a piece about me in today's New Haven Register about Stephen King, American Master. And I was asked, you know, my desert island books. And and you know, what's funny is that when I did the Essential Stephen King, I did not include short story collections as a book. I included the individual stories for listing and discussion and ranking. And yet I included Bazaar of Bad Dreams on my desert island list because I think it's a magnificent collection. I absolutely love it. But the thing is, his shorter work is sometimes overlooked. Would you believe I've had fans, when I do my talks on King, the book, fans come up to me and say, oh, you know, I never buy the novella or short story collections. I only buy the novels. And I said, ma'am, you're missing a lot of really terrific stories and writing. I mean, there's the 4 novella collections, and then there's the 25 short story collections. And those, they always hit the bestseller list because they're usually just incredible. And yet there are fans who say, oh, it's not a novel. Oh, no, I don't read short stories. I don't read novellas. And I just try and emphasize that if you like Stephen King, you're missing a lot. So I'm hoping that because this is now an individual hardcover book that's on the bestseller list, even though it's technically a novella, that the individual respect the publisher and King have shown this work will make fans buy it the way they did The Outsider and Sleeping Beauties, you know, and then read this and get what it's all about. That's my hope anyway. Yeah,
and that's a very interesting point you made about some people not reading his novellas or short stories. That's what this book is talking about, are limitations of our perceptions. If you make up your mind about something, you are closing doors. And this book is a chance for you to open your mind to other possibilities. So I really like that. And you don't want to really drill down too much into the ending. It's like your interpretation. I like to leave it open. The only thought I would have about the ending is that I would think that when his body has no mass, then he basically becomes energy, and then the need for like oxygen and whatnot are no longer necessary, so that he can travel through the universe. And in my mind, I see this picture of these two Scott Carries coming towards each other.
Right. Sure.
Wouldn't that be awesome? So yeah.
It would.
Yeah.
So I agree. And I like your interpretation that it's not really a face. It's light. It's energy.
Yeah.
That but the ultimate message is that he has transformed.
Exactly. Yeah.
He has metamorphed into a being of a higher plane.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very moving and very touching. And again, going back to what you were talking about with Shawshank is ultimately about hope.
Exactly.
And so's this.
Yep.
It's about two levels, two facets of hope, where there is hope that we can change people and that we can work through bigotry and intolerance and xenophobia and banish it from human existence. And then there's also hope that we live on.
Exactly.
That we rise to the next level.
Yeah.
And why it happened to Scott, why his mass didn't change, but his weight did, he doesn't answer. We don't know, which is, I the first question I asked. Scott is getting on the scale, and he's losing a couple pounds a day, 3 pounds, whatever. And I'm saying, what is he losing?
Mm-hmm.
What specifically is he losing that the weight is going down if the shell remains? And regarding the turkey trot, the road race, I read, I'm pretty sure I got this right, but I may be off, that he looked 240, but the scale had said 120. So he had this lightness, this weightlessness almost, or reduced weight, that allowed him to charge ahead, even though he looked like he looked like a podge, which was I love King's choice of that word, that he could eat anything he wanted and not become a podge, which is a short, fat man. It's just great. It's just great. Your vocabulary improves too when you read King.
Yeah, for sure. I also like, just again, this is consistent throughout King's story. It's just how he makes these characters come to life with just some choice phrases. The doctor and his wife, and of course the couple, Missy and Dee Dee, and their dogs, and all this, and the people that he runs to in the diner and has a bit of a confrontation with. Like they're hardly in the book, but they just stick in your mind because of the way King writes them, and it's just that, like, people complain that King overwrites, but this is an example of really crystalline, lean writing that does a lot with so little. It's just a very impressive piece of work.
It's very tight. Yeah. And as you're mentioning, his ability to create real world characters with very little wordage, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
He's a master at creating characters that, something? I know a guy like that. And it's funny, in Stephen King American Master, I go through all of the fiction, all of the nonfiction, unpublished stuff, and I talk about Nona, and he talks about, I quote something from an interview he once gave where he had long hair and he went into a diner and he got the look, and the way he described, it's like 1 or 2 paragraphs, but you know exactly what he's describing. The look, the people, the redneckers, the blue collar workers sitting in booths, seeing a guy with hair halfway down his back come in, you can understand instantly that entire paradigm. You know what they're thinking, you know what King is experiencing, and he used that in Nona, in Skeleton Crew, that kind of. And it's just, I interviewed Jerry Williamson for my King Encyclopedia long time ago. He's passed away, but he was a terrific horror writer, and I interviewed him about King, because for the encyclopedia, all the interviews were, what do you think about Stephen King? Has he influenced your writing? What do you like about him? What don't you like about him? And Jerry came up with a thing that has always stuck with me. He said, and this is back in the day. I mean, I was writing this in the mid-'80s. So King had been publishing for 10, 12, 14 years, not 30.
Right.
And already he had created a body of work, a canon. And Jerry Williamson said, who used to write as J.N. Williamson, he said, Stephen King is a noticer.
Yes.
And he made the point that you have to capitalize noticer. He wanted the capital N. He said Stephen King's radar is always up, and he sees things. And he kind of like trained me. For many years, I used to help my uncle in our family jewelry store. On weekends, I'd go in and help him, and it was my aunt and uncle, so I would go in. And I started noticing little things like when a woman has a pocketbook on her shoulder and she leans down to look into a showcase at a ring or something, her left hand always pushes the purse back so that it doesn't swing forward. And that happens all the time. And I said, it illustrated to me what King does constantly. He notices little things like that, but also the much bigger things. And we're able to understand his characters so much more intensely because we can almost read their minds. You know, an image I've often used is that we don't, in fact, Kevin Quigley wrote about it in the book. I asked him to write about this immersion thing with King, where you almost don't see the words, that you're like pulled through the book.
Yep.
And in fact, in the new book, Reading Stephen King, I did an essay about how King's writing is telepathy. Like it's a mind meld where the words and the structure and the way he writes are such that once you're in the zone and once you're zooming through those pages, you're literally being pulled through the book. And it's a unique gift, and yet it's not something that every writer can do. Plus, his work is literarily more significant than the perception as well. So there's a lot going on with King's stuff. There always has been, even with his nonfiction. His essay Guns is incredible. His reviews, I mean, he reviewed Raymond Carver's collected short stories and a biography of Raymond Carver for the New York Times Book Review. And his insights were awesome because he's a huge Raymond Carver fan, as am I. And yet it wasn't something that they asked just somebody who's a regular genre writer to do. This was something that they knew King could handle. And that says a lot. It really does. And then as he continues to create these works that are just incredible reads, of course, but also important American literature, it's just something that I like to call notice to. Even though I haven't, my American Master book is my first book about King in 17 years. The Encyclopedia and the Essential King Lost Work, those have a presence in the community. So people always think I'm writing all the time about King, but it's been 17 years since I did a book about King, and I've been watching and paying attention all these years and reading everything that he does, and I'm just more and more impressed with, I guess we'll call it literary longevity.
Yeah, well, anybody that can go through as many, and he's always been there. But you know, just lately, again, for whatever reason, I guess the political climate or whatever, he's really surfaced or shot back up to the top of social consciousness again. I really like the point that you made about King's writing in calling it telepathy. I've mentioned this on the podcast before as well, that for me, King is one of the few, if the only one, I can't really recall anybody off the top of my head, where the words on the page just basically disappear, and you're in the story, and it's like sitting around a campfire listening to somebody tell tall tales or something like that. The words disappear, and that is a gift that I would think every writer would love to have, because I enjoy reading, but I'm often very cognizant that I'm looking at words on a piece of paper. With King, that very often disappears. So I think you made a great point about that. And the other thing that King, like I mentioned, King writes characters well. He also makes general human observations pretty good. And I think the best one in the book is the one when they're talking about the late November rain. He said that liberals would say that was due to climate change, and conservatives would call that Indian summer. So it's this reference. It depends on your point of reference. And like you said, King is a noticer, and his last couple of works, like if everybody's read Flight or Fright yet, his story, The Turbulent expert, is also an uplifting tale as well, even though that one's a little more somber because there's a price being paid in that story and that's the kind of stories I like the best, where you have a victory, but it comes at a cost. It's not something that you can do casually. And I just think that King is reacting to what are pretty negative times right now, and with writing, which people would be probably surprised, like you said, the casual reader would say, well, he doesn't write uplifting stuff, like that lady in the supermarket saying that he didn't write Shawshank Redemption. These last two stories that he's written are, for me, are very optimistic overall. So I really enjoy that aspect of what he's doing now. And the word on the street is that he's already got another book done then, and it's going to be out next year. I have no idea what it's going to be about, but I'm very curious to see how his next story, if he's going to keep this trend or if he's going to go to something a little darker. The other thing I wanted to mention about King being a noticer is he's reacting to what's going on in his stories, and at the same time, readers are reacting to his stories based on what they're experiencing at the same time. And I think that's why I've seen some of these comments about the book being a little political and whatnot. And you mentioned all these things that the book's about. To me, those aren't political issues. Those are moral and social issues. Politics are just a mechanism to try to use to put your beliefs on top of over top of somebody else's. But so I really want to emphasize that this is not really a political book. There are some political observations, but this is really a morality, a philosophy tale.
It really is. You're absolutely right. But even more significant to me is the fact that some readers need to pigeonhole a book as this or that, I find very self-defeating in terms of the artistic experience. The fact is, again, art is a mirror, and King is writing about a time in which he has experiences, and the artist reflects what's going on in their lives, in the world, in their minds, in their imagination. I mean, if that's the case, then let's go back to the Dead Zone and say, oh, that's a purely political novel because
Exactly.
he paints a dark picture of a politician, you know.
If that was released today, people would be like losing their minds over it.
They would absolutely assume he was writing about Trump with Stilson. And yet Trump wasn't even on the radar back then. It was just King as an artist putting forth the notion of what happens with an authoritarian candidate. And you know, the book asks and answers the classic what if question. That's what King is extraordinary at. What if? And so now in this case, what if a lesbian couple moved into a conservative town, opened up a restaurant, and were bold and woke about being upfront about their marriage and introduced the other as my wife? What if that happened? And then there was a character in town who's experiencing some type of bizarre metaphysical experience that he feels ultimately has a higher purpose and a higher moral and social purpose, like you just said. So, yeah, I mean, it's clear that this is the stuff of which art is made, of which literature is made. And yet King can do it while telling a cracking good story. You know, you don't want to be lectured to. You don't want to be shouted and preached at when you write. I mean, we've all read novels where the writer preaches and yells and shouts, and it's obvious he or she is trying to put across a point. With King, he just tells you this story, invents these characters, creates these scenarios, these situations, and before you know it, not only have you experienced a wonderful story that you enjoyed reading, but you also hopefully maybe learned something, or at the least asked questions of yourself. How would I react? Would I go to that restaurant? Let's say a person is a raging homophobe, but they love Mexican food. Where's the line where you say, you know something? I don't condone their lifestyle, but man, that food is awesome. You know, and you know, you ask yourself that question, and it turns out that Scott helping her across the finish line just suddenly made the residents say, maybe they're not so bad after all.
Yep.
And the next thing you know, they're highly successful. And Scott was just following instinct. He was just doing what he believed needed to be done by helping her. And what was that? It was a total selfless act, because he could have easily just trotted ahead and won.
Yep.
And won the bet
Yep.
and everything. But instead, no, I'm going to pick her up. And she crossed first, which is a huge sacrifice. Again, here we go. Another self-sacrifice on the part of Scott Carey, who is expanding spiritually, morally, and socially, yet shrinking corporeally.
Yep.
Which is just a parallel that works like a charm in this book. It really does. I'm a big fan of Elevation. In fact, by the way, my Desert Island books, Elevation was in the top 10 as well.
Oh, cool.
But I totally cheated. I made number 10, the Dark Tower series. And somebody on Facebook actually said, well, gee, it's 8 books. And I said, yeah, well, my island, my rules, I'm on the desert island. And in fact, I said I also cheated with the short story collection because I rank stories individually. But here, I'll take the whole anthology.
Yeah.
And that's another 25 things to read. So, yes, I cheated throughout that ranking, but I didn't care.
Very good. So I have one last question for you. But before I ask it, is there anything else you wanted to say about this book that hasn't been brought up yet?
Only that for those King, you touched on this earlier, for those King fans who might be hesitant about what they've heard or the fact that it's small, or that they just don't think it would appeal to them, read it. My recommendation is that this is not just a story, it's an experience. And people are saying they tear up at the end. I mean, I completely get that.
Yep.
I understand that. I cried. I mean, the notion of him transforming into a body of light just struck a nerve with me. It really was incredibly emotional. And then, of course, putting Bill in the cat carrier, that bothered me too.
I agree with you 100%. It's an enlightening tale, and what else? You can't help but use these obvious puns, right. But it will, like Shawshank Redemption, which is a movie I watch at least once a year. It's food for the soul. And I just think that this is a lovely addition to that menu of Stephen King stories that you can read. My last question is, inevitably, this is going to be adapted in some manner or form. Would you prefer to see it as a movie or a TV or streaming special?
It can't be a miniseries because it would require too much padding.
Yep.
I don't see it. I see it as a movie. Although I would really like to see it not in theaters.
Oh.
I would love for HBO or Showtime, somebody serious, a major network with a major budget that could do it right, even though it probably wouldn't be that costly to produce.
Right.
But I would love to see it as a 2-hour HBO film, and it would fit perfectly. I don't think it should be stretched out into a 6-episode series.
Nope.
And I really don't like when they do. Well, I wouldn't want to see it theatrically because I don't know. I believe HBO and Showtime are doing incredible work with Hollywood producers and theatrical films. It's hit or miss. But I've not yet come across. I've been an HBO and Showtime subscriber for decades. And I've not yet come across something that wasn't of the highest quality. And I just believe that if the rights were frankly, I said that about Dark Tower. Look at what they did with Game of Thrones. That is just absolutely incredible. And Dark Tower had been, I believe Dark Tower should be adapted as an HBO series, multiple seasons, do 1 book a season, the way they're doing with Game of Thrones, sort of.
Yep.
But I believe they have the resources and the HBO mindset, the HBO mission statement is absolute respect for the artist and the work. And they don't really have to worry about commercial concerns because they're a subscription service. So an HBO film would be my number one pick for adapting this.
Yeah, I could see that. It's a gentle story, so I think it needs maybe the intimacy of somebody's home theater room to watch it in. I would love to see it on a big screen, though. But again, like you said, the chances for meddling would become greater. But you would need like a Darabont or a Rob Reiner if he was still directing. Or right now, of course, the hot kid is Mike Flanagan, who's doing Dr. Sleep. But it would need somebody of that ilk to make sure that the vision of the story is not compromised. But we'll have to see. And as for Dark Tower, that's with Amazon, so hopefully they will take the book a season approach if they do decide to greenlight it. But we'll have to see. It's inevitable, though, that this is going to be adapted. And I think it's important that it does get adapted between now and, say, 2020. That would be nice.
That'd be great. That would be fabulous.
Yeah. So that's it for our discussion of Elevation. And our discussion's probably longer than the book. But that's just how powerful a story it is. Is there anything else that you're working on right now, Steve, that you want to let our listeners know about?
Well, actually, my last nonfiction book was Stephen King, American Master. I've got a couple of other nonfiction things in the works, but nothing that I'm putting a great amount of time into. What I'm actually trying to finish by Christmas is a new novel called The Mighty Working, and it's about reincarnation.
Oh.
9 characters, past lives, and it's not that big. I'm projecting 55,000 words, but it's really something. I mean, I've had this in the works for many, many years, and lately I just took it apart and put it back together, and it's much better. And I can see the finish line, so to speak, and so right now, I'm working on trying to wrap that up.
Okay, 9 characters, 9 lives of a cat, eh? I see what you're doing there.
Yeah, very good.
Well, Steve, it was a blast to have you on again. Hopefully, down the road there'll be other Stephen King things or whatnot that we can talk about. I want to thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Lou.
No problem. And Steve?
Yes.
Good discussion.
Thanks.
I was saving that.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
So, Season 2, Mr. Mercedes, episodes 7 through 10. And those episodes would be Fell on Black Days, Nobody Puts Brady in a Crestmore, Walk Like a Man, and Fade to Blue. And these episodes, as Bugs Bunny was fond of saying in some of his cartoons, I should have taken a left turn at Albuquerque. This series really diverged from the book in the last 4 episodes. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm actually still trying to figure out. It depends on if there's a season 3, there's maybe a setup in there that it's subtle and not really dwelled upon too much. And it's totally my interpretation. I might be totally off base on this, so I'll get into that a bit. But let's just walk through these episodes. And I mentioned this in the last podcast when I was talking about Bill Hodges and his wife Donna, played by Nancy Travis. As the series went on, I really just liked that whole introduction of that character. Not because I have anything against the character or the actor Nancy Travis, but I just really found that she took away a lot of time that really should have been given to Holly and Jerome. Like, these are the main characters of your book, and I would have even liked more time with Ida, because even though she's not from the book, at least she was established in the first season. So there's 3 characters right there that really I think were underserved this season. And as you all know, I think it's pretty obvious by this point, I'm a big fan of the Holly character, and I was really disappointed with how she was just basically a hand-wringer for the last 3 or 4 episodes. She wasn't proactive. She wasn't using her skills at all. And so I would have to say that her arc in this season was pretty underwhelming. And Jerome's, I mean, he's not as prominent in the book as Holly is, for sure. But this whole storyline about his issues with his grades at school, plus his dad losing his job, that didn't go anywhere. And so that was also very disappointing for me as well. And Jerome's sister was barely in this season. Maybe they just wanted to establish her slightly for a potential season 3. And again, I'll get into what I think that might be a little bit later. I did like, and I've mentioned this before, I do like the Doctor. I thought Babineau, Jack Houston did a really good job. though it was very interesting that he was not in the last episode. Whether that was intentional or some sort of scheduling conflict, we'll speculate a little bit about that again further on. I'm sorry to keep pushing off my speculation, but I just want to get through the episodes proper before I get into that. And because, again, as I said, I might be totally off base on my theory about what season 3 could be about. So anyhow, I don't remember if it was in these episodes or if it was in the previous one. But we had the character, the librarian character, Mike Starr, who played Al. And he gives one of the most gruesome haircuts I think I've ever seen in a movie or TV to his brother. The first, the snip of the ear, and then the throat neck tie cut was pretty graphic. And again, they're showing this. This is part of the storyline from the book, that with the control of characters by Brady through the use of these electronic tablets, gaming tablets, that just died because in the episode Nobody Puts Brady in a Crestmore and Then Walk Like a Man, Brady is operated on and regains consciousness. And probably the most straining story element was the fact that he could get out of bed after all this time and just walk around and get around normally. And they realized this in the show as well. They reference it a couple times, but they never clearly put that one to rest. So that was where the beginning of that divergence took place. And of course, then we had the Lou character, who also had a bigger part to play, and for all of us, a very surprising part, I would think. She did a pretty good job. I think that I like that character a lot more. She probably had one of the most developed arcs of the season, even though the payoff was hard to buy, but there might be a reason for that. Again, hint, hint. So we have all these elements. It is a better focused Brady Hodges conflict this season. It was a nice moment, a very TV moment though, when they ended up side by side in the jail, and that's very doubtful that they would do something like that in real life. But of course, this gives a chance for the two characters to spar verbally and even a little bit physically at the end there. So we have all these elements. Big divergence from the books from the book at this point. And then we get to the final episode where Brady's put on trial and they call upon Lou to testify against Brady. That was a pretty intense sequence. I thought that was really well done. And then the big surprise, Lou pulls out a gun, a 3D printed gun provided by plans from Brady, no less, and kills Brady. And then Brady's lying on the table in the courtroom, a hole in his head, and he's smiling. So I'm looking at a lot of little clues here, and I think that season 3, if there is a season 3, could be the part of the book that they left out about Brady mind controlling people through these, whether it's computers or these tablets. I think the seeds were laid there on several fronts. Those seeds have to do with Lou. I think we saw through the season for her that while she may be pretty messed up, she's not a killer. And I don't believe that she had it in her to do what happened in the final sequences of the last episode of this season. I mean, she had a chance to do something to Brady before when he was in the hospital in the coma, and she didn't do it then. But she did remark in one episode that she was looking into some of the computers and tablets that Brady had been using, or I guess the one from Al anyhow, and she found imprints or telltale signs that Brady had been mucking around with those devices somehow. So I'm wondering if there was enough of Brady in those devices that he somehow set her up to do what she did in the final scene. And I think the reason why he did that was because he realized that he was a prisoner tied to this drug, and that he was on a clock, and that his time was going to run out sooner or later, whether he was spent the rest of his life in jail or if the medicine that he was being given would start. I think he was going to develop brain tumors and whatnot. So he knew he was on a death sentence. So I'm wondering, speculating, if the almost offhand remark about Lou about Brady's imprints in the computers are the setup for the third season, and we're going to see that play out in that Brady is now inhabiting computers or whatever, instead of this series ending the way it did in this season. So it's pretty suspicious that Brady was the one that actually supplied Lou with the 3D printer plans for the gun. I think that's another clue. And then there's, again, the disappearance of Dr. Babineau in the last episode of the season. And that's very curious that he would not be at the trial after being there for all the other sessions. So could it be that Brady's already controlling Babineau and is using him to set up whatever is going to happen in the third season? I don't know. But if that turns out to be true, I think that gives me a higher overall mark for the second season. I still like this season more than the first season, but I think the essence of the books was lost, especially with the Holly-Jerome relationships. And there was a lot of clutter in here that was just used to pad out the season to fill a 10-episode order. So people's mileages are going to vary on this. I know a lot of people really like the first season, and I've heard from a few people now that they actually like the second season better than the first. I definitely did, but I don't think that they're capturing the true tone and spirit of the books in this TV series because they're downplaying some of the important characters from the book in favor of other characters. So that's my opinion on the second season of Mr. Mercedes. It'll be very interesting to see if there's going to be a third season. There's some speculation that if there is, it could be The Outsider, because Jack Bender does have the rights to the Outsider novel for adaptation, but whether or not that's going to come true or not, we'll have to see. Or could it be this continuation of the book, End of Watch, playing out in this more computer, internet, tablet-based plot line? We'll have to see. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. What did you think of the second season? I think we were all probably shocked by what happened. Don't think anybody saw that coming, that Lou would get up in the court and shoot him. Though in the moment, like when she was on the stand in that, I think we were all starting to get the vibe that there's something more going on here than just her testimony. So it was still shocking that she did what she did, though I don't believe it's in her character. And I'm surprised that, well, not really, because they obviously want to leave us a little bit of shock, but I think Brady smiling as he's dying, and I think that Hodges, knowing the way he knows people, I think he would have, his spidey sense, if you want to call it, his gut instinct would have told him that Lou is not capable of doing what she did either. So it'll be interesting to see how this all pans out. And I'm looking forward to the next announcement about this series, because I think that will start to answer a lot of questions for us all. That is season 2 of Mr. Mercedes. What'd you all think? Let me know. And that is it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I want to thank Mr. Spignesi for coming aboard. Just a fantastic discussion about Elevation. Maybe we both gushed about it too much. Maybe you didn't like it as much, but hopefully at least we explained why we enjoyed it, and we just didn't come across as Stephen King fanboys, because I think I'm pretty consistent in calling things that I don't like. If you've heard any of my previous podcasts, you know I just don't drool over everything, but I really enjoyed this book quite a bit. And when I read it the second time, it was even more emotional and gratifying than the first time. So I think it's just a brilliant piece of work, and I really enjoyed it. And in our next episode, episode 97, I'm going to bring aboard Tyson Blue, a blast from the past. Tyson Blue, if you remember from our previous podcast a while ago, was on the set of Maximum Overdrive. And the reason I'm bringing him back is because Vestron Video has released a special collector's edition of Maximum Overdrive on Blu-ray. So this is the first time we're going to get a quality print of the film to watch. If you're like me, you've seen this movie many times probably on videotape, and there's a bad DVD version of it out there as well. But yeah, we're going to talk about what we thought of it and all the special features that included with as well. So hopefully you guys have got a chance to get this disc, and if not, get it so that you can join in when we have our discussion about it. Also, I'll be reviewing Mr. Stephen Spignesi's Stephen King, American Master, and it's a great coffee table book, and I look forward to discussing it further in the next podcast. But until then, as always, stay safe, but stay scared. The end. Boole.